Hey guys, today we're going to go over some basic stuff to do to your bike before a national. This weekend, Rock Hill, South Carolina is having a Worlds qualifier, so we're going to make sure both of my bikes are extremely dialed. Here's a couple key things to check. Always check your chain tension. So you're going to want to have a little bit of play in your chain. You want your chain to hang a little bit. This chain, a little looser. You want to make sure it's got like a 1/4 inch of play back and forth. Mine's got about a 1/2 inch. Alright, so my chain does have a little bit of play in it. So what I'm going to do, these are called chain tensioners. What I'm going to do to make sure I can tighten my chain is I'm going to loosen the bolts that hold on my hub, and then I'm going to tighten up this. And that's how we're going to make that chain tension a little bit less slack. So my hub has a size 6 Allen key. That's what I'm going to use to loosen that. Now that that's broken, it's going to leave room for us to tighten these. Alright, so all these do is they pull your wheel backwards. So it extends the chain, making it a little bit tighter. We're going to make sure that it comes back evenly. So whenever you do this, you're going to want to have to get your right size Allen key, and you're going to want to tighten it in small cranks. So about 1/4 crank. This one was a little loose, 1/4 crank. Ooh, might need a little more. We'll do another one on that one to make it even. So that looks like that should have been enough. On chains, you never want to overdo it, because if your chain is too tight, it might break. You don't want to come out of the gate really strong and just have your chain snap on you. That doesn't feel good. So make sure little adjustments. It might take a little bit more time depending on how loose your chain is or how particular you are about how tight you want it. Alright, so we're tightening it back up. Boom. Alright. So now what we've done is we've tightened it back up. One thing you want to make sure, well, not one thing, there's a couple things you want to check after tightening it up. Whenever you tighten these bolts back, right here, it's going to tighten your chain up more. So if you thought your chain was too loose when you were tightening your chain tensioners, you're going to want to check it again after you tighten the bolts down for your hub, because that will tighten everything. So we'll look at my chain. Your chain is always going to have a tight spot. Mine has a very small tight spot right here. If your chain is perfect, it won't have a really prominent tight spot. So mine looks like it's pretty good. Cranks still spin freely. So in addition to checking your chain's tension, there's two other pieces that are really simple that you're going to want to check. Alright, so the first thing, you want to check your crank arms. If your cranks are loose, you're going to feel a little bit of play back and forth like this. Mine actually does have a small bit of play, so we're going to fix that. I'm going to show you how. You're going to want to have an Allen key set. Usually about a 5, 6, and a 4, because that's the general size, but it's going to vary bike to bike. So what you're going to do to make sure that crank arm is tight is check a couple things. First of all, this is how you actually move the crank arm inwards towards the bike and tighten it all together. So these bolts right here on either side of the crank arm, usually they're on either side, sometimes they're on both sides, but on mine they're on opposite. These are how you're going to tighten your crank arm. So what you got to do first is loosen those. Alright, so now that we've loosened those bolts, we're going to have to tighten this bolt down. Usually, you don't want it too tight because you want those cranks to spin freely. So what I'm going to do is about a 1/4 turn, just like that. Feel it? Doesn't really go back and forth? Perfect. Tighten it back down. And boom. Still spins freely? Perfect. Sometimes that crank arm part and adjustment is going to take a little bit more effort, like if you notice your bike has been a little creaky, like the bottom bracket makes noises whenever you pedal, what you're going to want to do is take the whole assembly apart, not the actual bottom bracket, just take the crank arms out, which is the same operation. You're going to loosen that, take that out, but you can see all that in a different video. I'll show you guys how to do that. Alright, so one extra thing that you're going to want to check is to make sure it's all actually tight, because if you don't tighten your parts enough, they're going to come off when you're riding. So, well, they're not going to come off, they're going to start getting looser over time. So what I always do after I tighten these pinch bolts back down is I'll tighten this just a little bit just to make sure it stays. Perfect. These ones you always want to just go back, double check, make sure they're tight enough to not twist with your arm like that. Perfect. So we're still on the drivetrain. Something I'm going to show you next is really basic but huge. You're going to want to check your chainring bolts. Your chainring bolts have two parts. The first part is this side, which is going to usually fit a size 5 or 6 Allen key. In my case, it's going to be a 5. So, size 5 Allen key. And then here's the interesting part. you're gonna use your least expensive tool you will ever own for a BMX bike, a penny. Now, the penny is really important. This part is where your penny goes. It's gonna fit in these tiny little grooves right here. And when you have the Allen key on this side, the penny's gonna be on this side to counteract. So if you keep your chainring bolts tight, you should usually just kind of have to check it. You can usually check the play in your gear ring. If your gear ring is actually wiggling back and forth like side to side like that, that's not good and you want to fix it. Mine's pretty tight already, but one way to check it is just run through, go each one. So penny in the back, Allen key in the front, tighten, feels good. Always do it in a star pattern, so cross, 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 cross. Probably should have said cross pattern. Perfect. Alright, so now that you've done that part, it's always essential to check what track you're going to be on and make sure your gear ring is appropriate. On this bike, it's a really weird setup. I have a 38-16. If I'm on a track that's smaller, like an indoor track, I'll run a 37-16. If this gear ring in the front is smaller, it's going to be easier to pedal. You're not going to go as far with each crank, but you're going to come out of the gate really quick and your acceleration is going to be fast. Alright, so for this weekend in the World's Qualifier in Rock Hill, I made sure that I had the right drivetrain for the track. It's a long track, big stuff. I'm going to need a lot of top speed, a little less acceleration. So I got the bigger gear ring on the front so I can get more power and more top speed. And now here's the other thing to check. This is really important. So we got that right. It looks like our wheel is straight, our chain is tight all the way around, our hubs are all tight, everything is tight. Now what you want to check is your brakes.